Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Further Comments. Damien, Riehl, I haven't seen you for almost a week.
It has been almost a week, sadly. I've been to two cities since we've seen each other. So when we saw each other in New York, I went back to home for a little bit. My family maybe remembered who I am, and greetings from Chicago. So it keeps the assassins guessing. We have somebody really exciting on this talk with us today.
So we're very lucky to be joined by Ken Crutchfield. Ken, welcome to the call.
Thank you for having me.
For those who don't know Ken is a veteran of the industry. He's got 40 some years of working in legal and tax and kind of related markets. He's worked for large organizations and that we all know, like LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters and Bloomberg and Wolters Kluwer, and you kind of know everybody and know everything. So Ken, you're going to help us navigate this market right now, which everybody I think recognizes is in a bubble. And the question is is it a good bubble? Is it a bad bubble? What's going to happen here? Or maybe even we ask the first question, is there a bubble at all?
Great question. And I think we are in a bubble. It's just the question of how long is the bubble? Will the air come out of the bubble smoothly, or will it come out with a big bang? Those are, I think, the big questions to me. And I kind of feel like this is a world where I'm thinking about it as if we're in the roaring 20s again, since it is 2025, maybe a century back, but looking at this and saying, where are we in that parallel? Are we closer to 1920 and 21, or are we closer to 1929?
We've had bubbles, of course, in the 30s, but then we've also had bubbles closer to the present in the 1990s to 2000. I've been thinking about bubbles for quite a while, for many months, and I've jammed with Google, Gemini, and with ChatGPT and Perplexity and with Claude. And I said, if we were to do an analogy with the 1990s internet bubble, in what year are we today with large language models? And strangely, all of them coalesced around, they said we're probably about 1997 or 1998. The bubble burst around 2000 or so. And of course, we didn't really societally get websites and the internet into our daily lives until maybe 2005, 2006 or so. But if past is precedent, then maybe we are a few years out from maybe things collapsing, and maybe a few years even more from us societally absorbing all of the large language models. But I wonder if our exponential growth is changing that calculus.
Compressing it, right.
Compressing it, right? The internet started, ostensibly in the 1970s when ARPANET came out. And then you had the 1990s when Al Gore, he gets a lot of crap for saying he invented the internet, which he didn't. He just said he helped fund the internet, but that was in the 1990s. Then it took about a decade before it started really weaving its way through the process. ChatGPT was the fastest growing consumer product. And we already have the infrastructure of the internet to be able to compress this. So I wonder, what do you think about compression of the bubble timelines?
I mean, I hope so, because I can't deal with another 3 years of hype before anything useful comes along, and then another 5 years of waiting before it's everywhere and actually being productive.
So I think we've got to look at this from maybe a surfing analogy, that there's a wave that we're on, and we've got to be able to navigate that wave. And if that wave gets bigger, we don't control it. And that wave is GPU, compute power. It is building data centers the size of Manhattan in Ohio. It's competing with uses for water. It's finding new ways to power these data centers and to build the computing power with NVIDIA chips or others that are on the U.S. shores also, because we've got a geopolitical backdrop to all this. So I think there's a lot going on there that is far bigger and have other layered motivations that start with basically world power, world political power, then get into the specifics of how do you scale, and then from there, how do you achieve benefits more broadly? And then on top of all that, you've got legal tech looking at things and how do you do things for lawyers that are beneficial when you know that wave is going to raise all of the technology businesses coming across there. And you're going to run into situations where we've seen where OpenAI is being used by people that couldn't afford a lawyer to argue in federal court and win.
So I'm going to focus in on one thing, and that is this idea of legal tech is a very, very small vertical in a much bigger piece that's going on right now, whether you consider that as a capitalist play for dominance or a geopolitical play. Big tech is really going to be the determinant on whether or not the bubble bursts. Legal tech will follow whatever happens. And I guess we, the industry, sort of all agree that AI is in some sort of a bubble from a big tech perspective. And if anything were to happen, what do we think is going to happen to legal tech?
We have up to this point in the conversation assumed that there is a bubble, and we assume that that bubble will burst. There's a question as to whether that assumption is true.
Yep.
If you listen to podcasts from the Valley, they talk a lot about how we are really in an exponential curve with all indicators of this exponential. All of the disappointment of lack of progress is really while we're going like this, but while we're in any part of that exponential, like at any given point, it seems horizontal rather than vertical. So like, oh gosh, it's been 2 months and we haven't had a game-changing change, right?
Where's GPT-7?
Yeah, exactly. So I wonder if the premise of we are in a bubble is actually true or not. But I guess for the purposes of this discussion, I suppose we could assume that that's true. But yeah, I think there's a real question.
This is where I go back to the 1920s and look at that, because it was more about scaling that. It wasn't about necessarily disruptive innovation. It was more about the fact that in 1920, radio was just becoming something viable commercially. You had 1 in 5 people that had electricity and appliances in their homes. You had roughly 1 in 5 people that had a telephone. You had roughly 1 in 5 households that had an automobile, which meant that 4 in 5 didn't have one of those things. And so the 1920s were a time where scaling up and expanding the number of households that were living kind of a more late 20th century lifestyle is a good analogy as to where we are now. The fact that we don't have Model 6.0 or something else like that is less important than it is to build up the infrastructure and the compute power, and then have some of these technologies embedded in other things with workflows changing so that you can actually achieve the benefits with what we have. If we didn't have another advancement in the AI technology, there'd be a long runway, I think, of being able to deploy and adopt and perfect the use of these.
I think that's right. And if we think about the internet as a more recent example, one of the big booms in the 1990s was fiber optics, because they said, gosh, there's going to be all this internet traffic, so let's build out a bunch of infrastructure, just like we're building out a lot of infrastructure now in GPUs and energy. The problem was that in the 1990s, the bubble burst, and those were just dark. All the fiber was dark, and so it was unused. So the real question is this going to be the same? Because if all of our suppositions are true, that a lot of the AI is going to displace a lot of what is currently human labor, that is human knowledge work is going to require all of those GPUs and all the energy to be able to do a lot of that work. Is it going to be dark like the dark fiber was dark? Or are we going to be fully utilized all this energy? And I would argue that maybe it's more likely that we're going to fully utilize every single electron coming out of the energy and every single GPU, and there's not going to be the problem of dark fiber. So I wonder if, questioning the premise, is there a bubble? Infrastructure bubble, I doubt that there's going to be one.
Well, let's separate that, right? Like when I'm talking about bubble, what I'm thinking is an economic bubble, in that funding for these startups, funding for these activities will suddenly go away. So yes, the infrastructure will exist. Yes, the chips are there, and the demand, I think, is there too. Like if you talk to anyone, they all want AI to do something. The question is, what do we want it to do, and how is it going to do it? So if the funding goes away, if the money just dries up, what happens then?
I think those are really central questions, because I think there are other things that layer in with liquidity. I mean, we all saw in 2008 what happened, with the housing boom and all the things that happened with the financial crisis. Part of that was just simply making sure that there was money to loan for small businesses that needed credit to be able to continue to work through a seasonal aspect of their business and not have to shut down. Those were some of the things. So I think there is a layer at the macroeconomy level that plays through here. But then I think that the big questions we kind of need to dig in a little more close to home with legal tech is, what's the addressable market for legal tech? If it's $15-20 billion in spend as it currently is, the $4.5 billion that was reported by Law 360 yesterday as being invested new this year, which is year to date, versus $4 billion in the first 9 months of last year, I think that's too much money. And I think we're going to run into a situation where that's going to play through. Now, the real question is, to what extent is the $400 billion or so in legal services and law firm spend the real addressable market, and can you get to that? Scott Mazarski has mentioned that a couple of times, and I think that's a great question, and that's probably the rationale for why some smart investors are still investing in legal tech and putting more money in this because it's going to disrupt at that level.
So 1999 versus 2008. And I really like that you brought the, I guess, lack of liquidity with 2008. And that lack of liquidity is similar to the 1999, where it was based on a faulty premise. That is, the 1999 premise was to say that pets.com was a viable business. And the 2008 premise was that somebody who does nails in a nail salon is deserving of a $500,000 house, right? So these are both false premises that the economy realized, oh my gosh, this is shaky ground upon which everything goes away. Fast forward to today, and all of the investment is in NVIDIA and Microsoft and Google and Amazon and all of these companies that are not pets.com, and they're not the nail technician. And so the real question is, those nail technicians and pets.com went away. Are Microsoft, NVIDIA, Google, are they likely to go away? And are we really investing that much in the pets.coms of today?
Maybe Robin, AI is a good discussion point at this point. I don't think that they're pets.com, because pets.com, if I recall the story, was basically trying to ship dog food, which was too expensive to ship. And so you were never going to make money off of that. It was just a false idea. You could grab market share, but you'd lose more money the bigger you became. Whereas Robin AI, I think, has a viable model. The cost of acquiring revenue has been a challenge. And then I think there's also something that's maybe a little counterintuitive with their model, because if you recall, they bought part of what had been LawGeeks. And so they have this human in the loop, which I think makes a lot of sense. But as a technology developer, as opposed to a technology user like an ALSP, I think their cost structure might be a little higher because they're building technology that they're also using, as opposed to being like an ALSP that would provide the same contract review and everything else, but they can just pick whichever is the best technology of the day or the year to be able to deploy and provide that kind of service. So I know that's not all that they do, but I think that's part of it. But it also kind of ties back into that cash crunch, because if we're hesitating on the ROI, and so we're not going to give you more money, and you're in the middle of trying to balance out, and can you cut enough costs to be cash flow positive and neutral? That's a big deal. I don't think that's the bubble bursting, but I think it's kind of the shape of some of the things to come. The other point I would just make there real quick is, OpenAI created DocU-GPT, which is basically contract extraction. It wasn't data extraction for Microsoft Word. It was specific to contracts. And I think even if that was a couple of rogue or highly independent engineers there doing something, they're looking for addressable markets where there's money. And I think that's something that we need to recognize, because as an investor, I'd probably step back and really want to know what OpenAI is doing before I would put more money into something that they dip their toe in directly.
It's not just OpenAI, it's also Microsoft. Yesterday, I was on a webinar where they talked about, yes, you could be able to do all sorts of contract things. And Satya Nadella, when they were rolling out, I think it was a month and a half ago, they said, look, you can extract all this data from contracts. And look, you could be able to see which contracts have these legal risks. And this is good answers for the CFO. But what he didn't say is you could bypass the chief legal officer or the general counsel, right?
Right.
But of course, that's the unstated statement. There's a real question of if big tech, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, could be able to capture some of the legal market and all the other knowledge markets like medical. They say health, right? Because health doesn't require the practice of medicine, right? And legal information doesn't require the practice of law. So if they can capture medicine and law and others, then are Microsoft going to drop in a bubble? Or will they continue going up, and will that investment truly be good and the bubble remains inflated?
And by the way, Ken, I think you're very generous and kind by saying maybe OpenAI had a few rogue engineers. I think it's part of a very structured play that they're going after these verticals. It's not a 250,000 video production that a few rogue engineers managed to put together, right? It's starting to mirror the whole forward deployed engineer model that Palantir is famous for. OpenAI gives you a couple of engineers, builds all of these workflows, and then it's like, oh, but you can just license our software now to power these workflows that we've built for you. Harvey and Legora, I know they're on everybody's minds at the moment. They have a very similar sort of service plus product model. They're, customer success people in there, build you the workflows, and then click your fingers. Hey, guess
Right.
what? Harvey and Legora can service this now. It's now OpenAI and Anthropic and the foundation models competing with legal tech specific vertical platforms.
From an antitrust perspective, in a different era, you would have areas where you'd say, no, you can't become this powerful. But this is where the geopolitical starts to play in, and it's more about the United States needing to win the AI industrial revolution, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so we'll deal with those issues later. I think if OpenAI could wave a magic wand, they might buy the data from Lexis or Thomson Reuters, but let them service that last mile of the actual law firms and the legal markets. But they can't realistically do that. You can't wave that magic wand. So the real alternative is to just dig in and plow through as deep as you can directly. Or will we see someday acquisitions like OpenAI headlines acquiring an industry vertical player like a Thomson Reuters or somebody in health or somewhere else?
Antitrust enforcement or lack of antitrust enforcement really goes to what Sean West has been saying in his book Unruly, which I still think is one of the most important books that I've read in the last 2 or 3 years. And his premise of the book is that if competitors are competing in a marketplace, say you and I are competing and I stop at every single stop sign and you kind of do a rolling stop through that, you're going to beat me. And the real calculus for you is how many times are you going to get caught? Because if you're not going to get caught, let's go ahead and roll through as many stop signs. So I think what we're seeing with AI is that people are rolling through stop signs left and right. OpenAI released Sora 2, and they said, hey, copyright, you can be able to use copyrighted characters, but copyright owners, if you want to opt out, that's cool. With that opt out, people were making all sorts of crazy stuff because internet, right? And then they gained market share with Sora 2. And then after a few days of that, after they gained market share, they said, oopsies, let's make it opt in, not opt out. So that was rolling through a stop sign. And who's going to enforce that? And so that is kind of at a micro level. And Ken, you were, of course, talking at a macro level. From antitrust enforcement, rolling through stop signs is going to be the name of the game for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
Well, and lawyers are amongst those, right?
Yes.
And really, this goes to a macro thing that I think Horace and I have talked about in the past, is that if the rule of law is crumbling, which I think it is, there's people that study this saying worldwide the rule of law is crumbling. And within the United States, one aspect of the rule of law is the amount of civil representation. And the fact that 92% of legal needs are unmet because our lawyers are too expensive, that means that the rule of law within us, we've locked out a whole bunch of people from the rule of law. So if the rule of law is truly crumbling, both because of lack of access to justice and for all the stop sign rolling through antitrust, lack of enforcement, et cetera, then if the rule of law goes away, then what's the point of legal tech? Because we can tell you what the law is that nobody's going to follow. And so this is existential to our industry, that we need to uphold the rule of law.
Right.
Because if not, our product is not going to be valuable. Who's going to buy a product to say the rules that nobody follows?
Pirates of the Caribbean. It's not a rule, it's more of a guide.
That's actually Ghostbusters also, but I'm showing my age. I think, we're having a bit of an Uber moment here too, in the same way that Uber rolled through the stop signs, if you will, of taxi medallions in New York City and got the popular movement behind them. We love this service. How could you ever take it away? And I think that's part when you talk about access to justice. OpenAI, ChatGPT, Anthropic, all these technologies being used by pro se litigants and people that just want their dispute resolved, or attorneys who just need that information, even if it's outside of the policy of their firm. They're going to go use it because it's easier to get the answers and makes their life easier. I think that's going to be a big driver in this. And then it's going to be the question of, okay, like do the Lexuses and the Thompsons and some of the strategic players, the iManages of the world, start to, embed and create more industrial strength last mile, or is it going to be new entrants in different areas? One of the things I've always struggled with drafting technology is you're always living in a Microsoft world. You're sitting in Microsoft Word, you're using SharePoint, you're using email, and now you've got Copilot. I think you're always going to be watching your back.
So let's talk about, okay, let's assume, yes, there is a bubble. Let's assume, yes, funding is going to start drying up. So looking forward, who do we think is going to remain standing in 12 to 24 months? Like, let's say funding dries today.
I think one thing that we haven't really talked about yet here is the benefit to the legal industry itself. I think the legal industry is going to change a lot, and whether 150 contract lifecycle management companies all survive, or just a handful in the functionality of managing contracts and the whole life cycle of them does, lawyers benefit. People who depend upon legal advice benefit. And so that's one of the things that I think we need to recognize, is that if we think of the law firms and the legal industry as technology users, it doesn't really matter to a degree how much gets played out by the big strategic OpenAIs of the world versus the big strategic existing players in the market versus the breakthrough new ones that continue to thrive or maybe get acquired by somebody as consolidation inevitably happens. I think that's my first point, is to just kind of reassure that from a legal perspective, anybody in the audience listening that's a lawyer and listening because they want to keep track of technology, as long as you're a technology user, you're probably in good shape.
Let's say the bubble bursts, like Horace has posited. The bubble is not going to burst for OpenAI and not going to burst for Microsoft and not going to burst for Google, right? It might burst for the legal AI functions, but I think that the rocket ship that OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google are on is not going to go away. And if that's true, then the idea of shadow IT, that is, I as a law firm, might have the model that my firm permits, but of course everybody has these and everybody has personal laptops. And so of course they could be able to use these models that are going to continue getting stronger through 26, 27, 28. Of course, those shortcomings are going to be that they might not have data. That is, they might not have yesterday's case. They might not have yesterday's statute or regulation. They might not have the stuff stuck in lawyers' brains. What happens in closed-door meetings, negotiations, within the judges' chambers, right? These are all things that OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft will lack. And of course, I, as a lawyer in a law firm, might be able to put that into my corpus, to be able to say, in antitrust cases, this is what matters when I speak with the regulators, or in litigation, here's what happens when I speak to the judge. Even if a bubble bursts, the data is going to be a moat, whether it's a law firm putting that data in or the few remaining players that are still around putting that data in.
I agree with both of you, by the way. Like, first of all, I think the technology is real. It's not going to suddenly disappear tomorrow. The data centers are going to be around. And even if like the proprietary players like OpenAI and Anthropic go bankrupt, you've got Llama, you've got open source models that are going to be really powerful and can make use of these chips. I also think that data is a moat. Damien, we've talked about this a few times. In legal, you've got Thomson Reuters, LexisNexis, and VLex, and now Clio, right? You guys have the data, and it's going to be pretty hard for anyone else to catch up to that. But I think there's a third element to it as well, which is the expertise of the lawyers to be able to prompt models, to be able to ask the right questions. That's not going anywhere, and that's not being commoditized, at least not yet. So I don't think lawyers have anything to be afraid of. I guess the question is like, how do they prepare if a vendor that they're using suddenly disappears tomorrow or is then gobbled up by someone else? What can they do to avoid that catastrophe?
I'm going to follow up on one thing that you said, that prompting is still going to be a necessary skill. I would question that premise. Because if you've used deep research, whether it's Google's deep research or OpenAI's deep research, you could ask a crappy prompt and it'll come back with clarifying questions. If you ask a legal question, are you in California or in New York? Like, what is your jurisdiction? It will actually help the bad prompting. So I really question that premise, whether we do need to be prompt engineers. Because Sam Altman said on stage, I hope prompt engineering isn't a thing. Because if I'm doing my job correctly, you won't have to be prompt engineers. So I think the real question to Horace's particular question is, do lawyers have domain knowledge that OpenAI doesn't yet have to be able to ask those kind of nuanced questions that OpenAI can't yet? And that will depend upon whether OpenAI has the cases, the statutes, and the regulations, and enough data in that corpus to be able to ask those smart follow-up questions.
Working with my $20 OpenAI ChatGPT license, where I've asked it to do something and it's made a suggestion that I haven't told it about me. It's spot on. And so I think to that point, the prompting may be less important. The data is absolutely 100% important. I think getting your data right, which is something I've said in other forums too, making sure that your metadata, that your organizing principles are there, that the relationships are defined, because you don't want AI guessing probabilistically on what something is that's knowable because you've established relationships in your data that it can easily navigate. So that's I think one thing that's important. The other part to not lose sight of is relationships and distribution. So the fact that a lawyer is trusted on a particular engagement shouldn't be underestimated, because oftentimes the value of why you pick a consultant or a lawyer to do something specific is because of those intangibles about the relationship you trust. You know that they can make it right in other ways. Let's have this conversation actually with Mike Bomarito, who says hi. Earlier this morning, we were talking about why wouldn't you do something for less money? I'm like, well, if you can go to a professional services firm that's trusted and they can't solve the problem or they screw it up with a data conversion, you still keep your job. You can blame the third party. And why would your boss think that you could do it better when it's the first time you've done something and the other professional services organization or lawyer has done this 100 times? Those are the sorts of things that I think are also important to recognize. And I think that plays through for legal tech also. Can you develop those relationships? Can you build access and get access to customers and have that as another place that's glue? So I think those are super important. The last one I'll just mention real quick is, I wrote an article about 2 months ago on what if you knew OpenAI's roadmap. And I think it's a very healthy exercise for anybody in the legal tech space in particular to think through what are the things that OpenAI is highly likely to do. So integrating calendars, creating one-to-many relationships where you have more than one person asking the same chatbot in the same thread, or vice versa, having different personas of different chatbots that are talking back to you, thinking that through and recognizing that OpenAI is starting to work on age restriction permissions because they're going to get into adult content and other things. What other list of things are they going to do that's either publicly known or otherwise would you want to know, so that you could then focus A, on your data and getting your data right, because that will survive any of these things. And then B, if you're going to build certain functionality, make sure that it's defensible functionality.
I think that's spot on, Ken. What you've just said mimics what Jordan Furlong. If you don't follow Jordan Furlong on Substack, you should. He's on the short list of people that I respect. And every time he comes out with a new Substack, I sip it like fine wine. Other people's articles, I'll throw into ChatGPT and I'll say, give me a summary and that kind of thing. But I read every single word of what Jordan says because it's so brilliant. And in October 9th, he said, aligning with what Ken just said, he said that we as lawyers self-trust. I, as a client, trust you as a lawyer because I trust that you have experience that I don't have and that ChatGPT doesn't have. So that personal trustworthiness is one of three things. Number two is integrity. Are you a person of integrity that won't screw me over and that will be able to deal fairly with the other side? And then number three is maybe most important is intuition. While I'm sitting around the table negotiating this contract, I won't be able to have ChatGPT speaking into my ear, being able to give the right response to the other side, or I won't be able to do that in chambers with the judge or in front of a jury, right? So that intuition to be able to assimilate is number three. So trustworthiness, integrity, and intuition, Jordan thinks, and I agree, are probably going to be all that's left that OpenAI and others cannot do. And then what's left also as part of all three is sales. Rainmakers are salespeople. They don't like to be thought of as salespeople, but as salespeople, you sell trust. You, as a client, can trust me, the sales guy, to say that my team can deliver what OpenAI cannot and what Microsoft and Google cannot. And so I think that the sales, trustworthiness, integrity, and intuition maybe is all that's left.
I learned this when I was doing professional services at one time, is develop a favor bank, especially in a large corporation. It works just like it does in consulting. You do things that cross the boundary of what you're supposed to do and help people out. And when you need help, you call it in. And that, I think, is what lawyers do. I think that's what strong consultants do. And, if a project's going sideways, you may not have to pay the overages on that project. You'll make it up somewhere else later using the favor bank. And I think that's something that, AI will never be able to do.
That's 100% right. In the 1980s, there was a TV show called Stingray. He was a rogue actor that would go in and he would do a favor for somebody. He would help somebody out and they'll say, how can I pay you? And he'll say, don't pay me. I might call on you someday to be able to do a favor. And then 4 or 5 episodes later, there'll be that person that he asked for a favor to be able to do that, right? So Ken, you've reminded me of Stingray from the 1980s. And That's right. I mean, OpenAI is not going to be able to repay favors. That's something that maybe humans are going to be able to do for a while.
You guys are almost saying it doesn't matter if there's a bubble and everything crashes, right? Because we can just all be Marlon Brando in The Godfather. I know that's a very crude way of putting it. It's stunning to me that when you strip it all away, it's all about human relationships.
Yeah.
It always has been, and it always will be.
You have to step back and self-reflect and recognize you can only control certain things. There are other things you can't control. And then you can prepare. If we could all predict the elbow in the curve, we would all be rich and we wouldn't be doing this right now. And I think that's the hardest thing in business to do is understand the timing of when something changes. So I think in the same way that, people that were highly leveraged in, their finances in the 1920s got burned in a highly leveraged way. Whereas people that stuck to, having a paid off house, if you were so fortunate as to be able to own a home or whatever, you still had certain things that you had. And I think that's going to be an important thing here is, we have to trust that larger powers are going to play this through and hopefully soft land anything like this. But we're in a world where those things may not happen. And so we got to look at that both from an attorney, a law firm, a law department perspective, from a legal tech perspective, for those listening that are in legal tech specifically, how do you mitigate your risk? How do you be eyes wide open about what's going on around you? And how do you look for the early indicators that might play through? I know my father had worked in paper, and one of the things that I had learned was one of the early indicators of an economic recession or economic upturn was ordering boxes. Because when people were ordering boxes, they weren't shipping anything and they weren't manufacturing. They knew what their forecast was. And so I think looking for little early indicators that are good are very important as people think how to navigate this. And hopefully we're not looking at this for a few years. And hopefully it is something that's a smooth, more muted landing when we do have an inevitable downturn. But that's my thought.
I love that analogy of boxes and being a leading indicator of something going down. I wonder if, as a law firm and as a lawyer, not getting phone calls, not getting work is maybe an indicator. That is essentially boxes not getting filled. That problem might be two things, one of two things. The first thing might be that the client just doesn't have work. Number two is maybe the client's going to a competitor. Right? They have the work, but it's just not going to you. Option number three is that the clients have the work and they're using large language models themselves to do that work in-house. Much like Salesforce said at Ilticon, first 6 months of the year, they've saved $3 million. By the end of the year, that's probably going to be $6 million in external spend that they brought in-house. So if you're a law firm, you're down $6 million annually. Is that because the clients didn't have the work or went to a competitor or used AI? They don't have that data to be able to see whether boxes have been shipped or not. I agree that we should try to find those leading indicators, but I think that the signal is really hard if you're a law firm.
From a CRM perspective too, I think lawyers are, since a firm is a partnership, don't always have the 360 view of their client, and they're less inclined to ask for customer satisfaction metrics, feedback, to understand what's actually happening, or to be able to partner and be in that world where they could help work go in-house if they knew that by getting a more strategic partnership on how to work through technology and adapt technology, they help their clients in a way that would drive more loyalty and deeper relationships that would drive more business.
Right. And a lot of that data is private, but a lot of it's public. If you're doing litigation, you could see, okay, my client hired me a lot for this litigation, but that dropped off. And you can actually see from the public docket to be able to say, oh, they've actually hired my competitor law firm, right? Knowing your client can be done through private sources and also through public sources.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to swing this conversation around to one of the very first statements you made, Damien, which is, what if there's no bubble? Like, if there is no bubble and the economics catches up to the technology, what should people be doing in this scenario?
Yeah.
Run as fast as you can. I mean, really, gather as much data as you can, gather as much market share and distribution as you can, because once you reach a moat of data and a moat of distribution, it'll be hard to catch up if we're truly riding the exponential or continuing to ride the exponential up. A lot of the foundational model folks are saying that this idea of recursive self-improvement, if you build a coder that can code itself, then the software builds itself. And good luck with the people left behind who can't build a coder that can code themselves. I would say the same thing for law firms. If you are left behind and people get both the data and the distribution, then it's going to be hard to be able to catch up.
I'll take a little more on the ground, but still kind of high level kind of perspective. I think for some of the valuations to play through here, a couple things have to happen. One is law firms need to be able to spend more on legal tech. That has to be a bigger part of their pro forma budget, 2 to 3 times. The challenge, though, it means that they also then probably have to productize those legal services in ways that corporations in particular will pay for it. And that's where we run into the issues with outside counsel guidelines, where outside counsel guidelines say things like, I'm not paying for first-year associates. I'm not paying for legal research. I'm not paying for anything that can be automated by AI. And if you do that, that's kind of reinforcing the billable hour thing where it's, I'm only going to pay for the staff and labor, which then makes it hard for law firms to actually shift their cost structure. Those are some of the things that I think are like super practical and super simple that have to be solved at the industry level between in-house counsel and outside counsel for legal tech to actually play through with the valuations and the investment that's going there. Otherwise, I don't see how some of these investments get monetized. If everything, you can take some work in-house, but law departments, it's always better, faster, cheaper corporations. So you're going to try to buy something automated out of existence and then try to cut your cost. So that's always going to be playing through. And I think this is one of the key things that really has to be addressed as an industry is there an appetite for corporations to pay for productized legal services and pay for it like a SaaS model? And what are the substitutes to doing that? Because that drives the economics of that. Those are the key things that have to play through.
I really like that. Of course, productization is something that we've thought about for a while. And of course, some law firms are actually doing that quite well in the immigration space. There's Greg Siskind, who's doing really cool things with productizing his cookbook of immigration. He's essentially productized that. But the examples of those are few and far between. The more common, I think, is that I, as a law firm, can shift from the billable hour to maybe what I'm calling incentive-aligned fees. So flat fees, subscription fees, contingency fees. These are all incentive-aligned fees that if you shrink your costs, you increase your margins. And you don't have to convince your client to pay for those associates or to pay for the technology, right? Because now we're aligned with our incentives. I can use my investment in AI to be able to make more profit margins. And so I think that the shift of big law to these incentive-aligned fees is going to be quite hard because you're going to have people saying, I'm making millions under my billable hour, thank you very much. So you can have a portion of big law saying, no, we'll stay with the status quo. The portion saying, no, I'm going to jump onto the aligned fees bandwagon. But then there's going to be a conflict with compensating the associates. Because if you say, hey, associate, you could build 3,000 hours. You made the billable hour folks a lot of money, but you've really cost the incentive-aligned people a lot of money. Now do you say, okay, only associates that work on billable hour get to do that, and you can't actually work for an incentive-aligned? That's hard. So that's a hard thing, but easy for me as a boutique to jump ship from that big law. And then I can say, no, this boutique is all incentive-aligned. It's all flat fee. It's all subscription fee. It's all contingency fee. And then everybody is rowing the same way in that incentive-aligned structure. And I think that those boutiques are going to take a lot of the cream, core, and commodity from the big law.
2 very quick analogies here. One was, or specific concrete examples. One was at the conference that we were at in Santa Cruz. Damien, one of the attorneys from Toronto, was explaining how he had struggled with productizing some of his capabilities, and he did it, and all the clients were valuing it based upon the number of hours he was sharing in a retainer there. But when he flipped it around and say, look, if you pay for this service, I'll give you a discount on hours. They're like, oh, well, that's great. I'll take that. That's a savings that I can get my head around. It was actually better for him. And that was one real concrete way that this, I think, was starting to play through. I also just got off a call as I'm preparing for TLTF because I'm going to do a Law Firm 2.0 panel there. And one of the companies that's going to be on the panel has got a model where it's pay for performance. So it's mirroring the contingent fee work in firms that do immigration, bankruptcy, and some of these other things. So only when a filing happens, only when there's an outcome, does an expense pay. So it's not a SaaS model. I thought, what a brilliant, interesting way to align and productize legal service.
I think we're going to see that more and more. Like you're seeing signs of it now. And I'll think of 2 examples. One is Crosby that just raised $20 million to essentially do commoditized work, but at an extremely efficient model, both internally and in the pricing. And the other is I saw a LinkedIn post saying that Ropes and Gray, which is definitively one of like, the ad law top firms, is starting to go into the mid-market M&A deals and really making an impact there, hitting where they would not have gone in the past. Those are sort of shifting the model, and possibly I know in the case of Crosby it's true, but in the case of Ropes and Gray, I think it's also true that they're leveraging AI to introduce efficiencies where previously they could not have done this with humans.
That's the rise of the AI native law firm. The other examples are Udia in the US, which is doing M&A things, Garfield in the UK. So I think we'll continue seeing a lot of these AI native firms that are going to say, let's go ahead. And I just spoke with another one that is kind of in stealth mode right now doing this work. But yeah, I think that there is going to be more of them because of course, right? If you are an Amazon.com that is relying on the internet, you're going to rocket ship past Walmart, which is having the innovator's dilemma. So I think that this is the innovator's dilemma at play.
That's a perfect analogy. I think we're coming to the end of the hour, but I want to ask you guys a slightly different question. Not what are you optimistic about, but what is your tip for adoption and transformation, regardless of whether there's a bubble or not? So Ken, why don't we go to you first?
I actually wrote about this last month also. So it was the idea of just-in-time training. So if you think of just-in-time as a manufacturing concept where you're only building product when you need to deliver it, I think the expectation setting is important. You're going to get your early adopters, which might be 10% of your firm or your department to actually use and enthusiastically work. But then you have to be prepared for that one-by-one lawyer that is like, oh, I now see the need for this because I have a client problem. In that world, it's going to get seared into their minds, how this technology will benefit them. So make sure that you're in the world of being prepared with pre-recorded training, other things, and do that special hand-holding touch and pick off attorney by attorney just in time as they need it and meet them where they're at.
I like it. I would say that mine is that there is a top-down approach and there's a bottom-up approach. Top-down is to say, we're going to try this AI thing with this narrow area and let's see how it works. And we're going to restrict your usage to this tool only. And this is where a lot of people cite the MIT study saying that 95% of these kind of top-down initiatives fail. Mm-hmm. But what they didn't mention is all the bottom-up initiatives that succeed. One employee that has one task or a million tasks that they do, and they're applying their own tool that they prefer for those tasks. And that bottom-up is remarkably good. So I would say that people should be encouraging bottom up. That's what the American Arbitration Association, Bridget McCormick in the AAA is doing, that bottom up. And that encourages the idea that a lot of people say, what should I read to learn about AI? And I'd say, what book do you need to read to learn how to swim? You don't, you swim, right? And so that bottom up encourages swimming. This would, I say, turn from the old world used to say, let's do an incremental, this one use case and expand that incremental small use case a little bigger. Ethan Mollick from the Wharton School, he says, no, people that do that fail. People that do comprehensive, let's do all the things. Let's be an AI native firm that does all the things. Those are going to be the winners. So I think that top down versus bottom up, number one, and the idea of incrementalism versus comprehensiveness, I think that you should do bottom up and comprehensive because those are the folks that are going to win.
Hiring is one other thing, making sure that you're hiring people that are AI native as opposed to ignoring that. That's going to impact culture in a very subtle way that's going to be super important in a couple of years as it snowballs.
Yeah. I'll leave people with one tip, and the tip is measure twice, cut once. So when you do find these really, really good use cases, actually figure out how you scale them, plan it out before you dump in lots and lots of money. If it's scalable, would then lead to much more success.
Do we have time to do an optimism?
Absolutely, we have time for optimism. When is there not time for optimism?
Horace and Ken. That's true. Horace and Ken, what are you optimistic about these days?
Oh, Ken, you go first.
I'm optimistic for lawyers that are going to benefit from the use of technology. I think law firms don't have to go build it themselves. I think there's some very practical places where building it, like an intranet site from the 1990s makes sense right now. But lawyers are going to benefit from technology irrespective of who wins. And I think that's the part that I think I'm most optimistic about. And I do think that there's going to be a lot of benefit from the scaling of AI technology in general, whether it's legal tech or just the foundations and infrastructure.
I'm optimistic about the tipping point in Malcolm Gladwell verbiage. I think we've passed that long ago. That is, if you think about AI, the law firms saying, I don't know if we're going to do things. I think that was maybe in the spring, but we are now well past that maybe we should do it or not. And we're saying now, how should we do it? So what makes me optimistic is the fact that the tipping point is now in the rearview mirror. Horace, what are you optimistic about?
It was a Cayman and I last week, and one of the sort of vibes I got from the room is people have gotten past the stage of believing that Gen AI is magic. That's a maturity. That's understanding, really understanding what the tech is good at, bad at, and what it's capable of doing. So I'm optimistic that we're going to start seeing a lot more real adoption, a lot of more real use cases.
Yes.
Love it. I think that's a great way to end. Thank you, Ken Crutchfield, for your amazing insights. Thanks to my co-host, Horace, for being one of the nicest and smartest people in legal tech. So yeah, thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you so much, Horace. Thank you so much, Damien. It's great seeing you guys. Great talking to you all. And I really appreciate you having me on.
Yes, subscribe. Click that button.
Smash that like button. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.